And it is my absolute pleasure to once again bring to this microphone one of the most powerful voices ever in the education, what I call the education salvation movement in this country. Former senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Education under President Reagan, one of the best and greatest whistleblowers of our time on the education subject. Her book, Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, is the most amazing thing. If you don't have it, you need to get it. She's got a new abridged paperback version available. The websites you want to pay attention to, deliberatedumbingdown.com and americandeception.com. Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt, welcome back to the Roger Fredinburg Show. Hi.
Well, thank you so much, Roger, and it's good to be back, and I appreciate that preface, or whatever one calls it. The two websites, deliberatedumbingdown.com and americandeception.com, really do provide just about all of the documents, research, to back up what I'm going to say today, or what I say all the time. And so that people can, they don't have to feel that it's my opinion. I don't know how I ever could come up with such a weird plan for the destruction of the United States, so it can't be my opinion. I don't know.
Well, I mean, you'd have to live under a rock in America today not to recognize that the last generation of high school graduates are some of the dumbest ass people on the planet.
I know.
And
but it's really tragic. I mean, it didn't have to be that way, and that's of course what we're going to talk about, and the fact that it was all, of course, the minute you say that something is deliberately planned, you're considered a conspiracy freak. That's smart. They really did a good job brainwashing people with that idea. So the minute anybody told the truth about what was going on, they were put down. And as a freak, or what was the first time I was called a kook, right?
Yeah, Charlotte, being a guy who was inside the Republican Party for years, Joe Republican supporter, rah, give me my pom-poms. I'm a part of the cult. Let me wave my pom-poms for republicanism, blah, blah, blah. And I was brought up in the party to believe that education choice was the thing, vouchers, charter schools, man, and then suddenly I begin to study under Charlotte Iserbyt, and I begin to realize that these charter schools are not what people think they are. Can you describe for the audience just what's going on with charter schools and why they're so dangerous?
Well, the major reason they're dangerous, there are a lot of other reasons, and I'll go into detail, but is that it's the first, I'm not saying it's the first entity, government entity that has been stripped of its elected boards, right? Because there are, through regionalism in this country for the past 40 years, regionalism, which is communism, by the way, people don't recognize that because they've never been told it, but I have the documents on that. Through regionalism, we've lost a lot of our elected officials at certain levels, county and sometimes at the local level as well. And borders have been erased between different entities and government entities, et cetera. But this is the first time a major segment of our society, like education, for instance, which probably takes up most of the budget, the local budget certainly for people, property taxes and all, is going to be controlled by unelected councils. Charter schools do not have elected school boards. That is really, for people who hear all these wonderful things about charter schools and all, that's the only difference between the charter school and the regular public school. There's only one difference, one major difference, and that's the public school system, as bad as it is, and I'm not defending it, and boy, you couldn't have anybody on radio more critical of the public school system over the past 50 years than myself, and I've written books about it and all. And so I'm not defending what was done to the system and to our children. All I'm saying is that there's one good thing left, If there's one good thing left in the public school system, and I think there are some good teachers left as well, who really hate all this stuff as well, but the only good thing left is that we have elected school boards. And I say to people, look, you may not have children, you may not even care about education, but you're going to care a lot when you keep having to pay more and more taxes for, I would sort of say, rotten food. You keep going back, keep paying more and more taxes as test scores go down. But you are really going to be upset when you find out that you can no longer go, first of all, and vote for somebody who might turn out to be okay on a school board. But the worst part is you can't get rid of them. Once somebody is carefully selected to become part of an unelected council, it's very unlikely that no, not unlikely. You can't get rid of that person. And basically, this is the Soviet system. I mean, if people who study the Soviet system know that I'm correct, they have unelected councils. And if you look up the word council in an old dictionary, they're not going to have it in the new dictionaries anymore. They don't want you to know. You'll find the definition of council is a Soviet. So, charter schools are very dangerous for that reason in itself. Charter schools, interestingly enough, are supported by both sides of the political spectrum. We're really lucky that last week the Secretary of Education, leftist Arne Duncan, who calls for paying students for good grades. It's like pigeon training, right? That's conditioning. Yeah. He called for that when he was in Chicago. That's our Secretary of Education, but wait to hear this one. Quite a surprise, even to me. I'm surprised he dared admit it. He came out strongly, I heard his speech, in support of charter schools. So isn't that interesting for all those people who tell us that, we're on the wrong track with charter schools and we don't understand how necessary they are, and they're going to give our children freedom of choice to have a wonderful academic education, all this and that. Well, you've got Arne Duncan supporting them, and then you have the Heritage Foundation supporting them. And then, lo and behold, they really are getting brazen with their admissions. You have the Council on Foreign Relations supporting them. So what on earth, folks, those of you who are not happy with people like me, and probably you, Roger, and some of us, not enough of us anymore, right? Not happy with us, saying this is not the way to go. When you see these three groups working together, then you say to yourself, well, who is running the United States? We don't have a two-party system anymore. The left and the right is in bed together. I guess maybe some of those researchers through the years who said that we were implementing the Soviet communist polytech school-to-work system lifelong, maybe they were right. And I wish that we weren't right, but today, we're going to go through this, and I want to, go through, it seems my whole life is spent going through chronological histories of things. But I always hope that will help people. And it will, what I want the audience to understand today is that everything that I'm saying, really just about everything, is documented. For instance, the key document from which everything emanates is a Carnegie Corporation book published in 1934. That was right after all the American educators had been going back and forth to the Soviet Union and oohing and ahhing on what a wonderful system it was. And so Carnegie wrote this little book. It's called, and right here up front, I'll tell you folks, you can go to AmericanDeception.com and plug into the search engine the word conclusions, just conclusions. That'll get you there. The booklet, it's very, very small book. It's the most important piece of research I ever got my hands on, and I've been involved in education research since I came back to the United States in the 70s from years abroad working. The title is Conclusions and Recommendations for the Social Studies. And in effect, it's a fantastic little book, very, very upsetting. It calls for using the schools to change America to a planned socialist economy in the new order. And there are always people out there, and they say, "Oh, well, you know, what is she talking about? You know, she's elderly. You know, she's talking about a document in 1934." Oh, how ridiculous! I mean, this is 2012. What on earth is she referring to that for? Well, I'll tell you, folks, I am referring to it because that is exactly what they stuck with, that plan. And they never deviated, and I'm just going to try to point out how they moved us through to the point where we're accepting unelected boards in this country, starting with the schools, which is the Soviet system. We're accepting that because over the years in education, because over the years they have been so successful in changing our education system from the finest one in the world, academics, changing it through values clarification, changing the American people through all of these values-destroying programs, putting in individualized education, which sounded so good. Parents thought that was good. No, that was necessary for individual education plans for each child to track their attitudes, their values, and ultimately to be used in organizing the workforce. Then they also changed our system from, and this is Carnegie involved enormously in all of these changes. They funded the national assessment that is 60% attitudinal, right? They funded the Education Commission of the States. That's major. Was a regional government plan where you had the regions, you had education, that one central place in Denver sent out all the plans to all the different states about the changes they wanted in curriculum, testing, etc. They did that. They signed the agreements with the Soviet Academy of Science, very important in regard to computers in early education, little tots. At the same time, President Reagan signed the agreements with Gorbachev to merge the two systems. They became very involved in the school to work agenda after President George Bush won, well, even before, but when he announced, in the congressional record that we had to move towards workforce training instead of academics, we had to, it is an incredible speech that's in the congressional record about President Bush calling for apprenticeships. And all of this, of course, I mean, maybe there are people out there who do not understand how central this is. You there, Roger?
Oh, I'm here.
Okay. How central this is to implementing the Soviet system, the Soviet economic system. And let me just read from something in 1976. It's a Los Angeles Times article. It's called, and I want you to relate this to what's happening right now, and it will be even more effective once they have the charter schools, because then they won't have unruly school boards saying, we don't want this kind of education for our children. We want academics, not training. They'll get the charter schools in, and there won't be any school boards to say no. Anyway, here's the article. It says, Havana, this is 1976. The door to the side room of an old cigar factory had been left ajar, and a small knot of children could be seen preparing boxes of cigars for export. Quote, it's part of our education system, end quote, a Cuban tobacco official explained. Quote, they are helping and learning, end quote. The children, elementary school pupils about 9 to 11 years old, were examples of the unique Cuban educational system of combining studies with physical work. Well, it was not that unique. That was the Russian system, Soviet system.
Right.
So that is what they're putting in. So anyway, signs the agreement with the Academy of Science for early elementary training for the children, critical thinking, all sorts, on the computer, mind you. Reagan is signing the agreements with Gorbachev to merge the two education systems. And then we keep moving on to the Reagan. You've got then we got George Bush, and we've got William Bennett, and we've got all the neocons coming on board out of the Democratic Party. They're really Trotskyites. That's what they are. So it took me a long time to be able to figure this out. If only I had known that earlier, like in the 80s when I worked in the Department of Ed, I would have figured it made sense. Because, Trotsky, what's the difference between Trotsky and Lenin? I mean, they all believe in a planned economy. So that's what happened. The Department of Education was, after Reagan got in there, totally infiltrated by Trotskyites. And then you had Bennett taking them all on board. You had Lamar Alexander, you have Chester Finn, you have all of these neoconservatives who actually don't have any problem with a planned economy. I have a big problem with it, and we have a really good quote. It's Professor Eugene Boyce, who, part of the quote, he's a professor down at the University of Georgia. Part of the quote just said, they do not educate, this is Soviet system, they do not educate for jobs that don't exist. Now think about that, okay? So what if you want to do something in your life that there's no job out there? Maybe you want to be a cellist or a painter or whatever, but they're not educating for that or whatever, huh? It's a total lifelong dictatorship where you're locked in to jobs that have been determined by the public and private sector. The corporations telling the schools, just like in the Soviet Union. I mean, we may not have the Soviet system completely yet, but in the Soviet, the Communist Manifesto, it's a merger of government and industry. In the United States, it's a merger of government and corporations. What's the difference?
Well, is this done through lobbying, or how does this come into being?
Well, that's what is so, because we don't have anybody speaking for us anymore. The left and the right are in bed together on this thing. So, yes, it's done through lobbying, through the drafting of legislations. They used to have ESSER, and then they've got the conservative think tank that everybody's been jumping on. What's it called? Help me out.
Or like the Heritage Foundation?
Well, ALEC.
Oh, ALEC.
The American Legislative Exchange Council.
Oh, those guys are dangerous.
They're constantly writing legislation for everything. It's not just education, but we're talking about education. The Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, which was the Rockefeller Group, and Ronald Reagan was very involved in that, they used to do all that drafting of legislation. What's very interesting is that they're both the same. They're just really, we have been so manipulated. Now it's ALEC that's been doing it. Thousands of bills, draft model bills that go into the state legislatures and are elected officials. So I don't know why they don't question it. Sometimes I wonder, what do they do? I mean, you elect someone to represent you in your state capital and in Washington, and you hope that they might read something or write something on their own. But they get this legislation and they just stamp it and they vote for it, and that's how we end up with these situations. Now, charter schools, that's school choice agenda has had a pretty rocky road because of the unions, of course, and but that's why I say how, let me just, this is a really good quote from Marjorie Liddell, who is a high-up American education change agent. And for people who don't know what change agents are, I'm just going to go off a little bit here. I was trained to be one in the 70s. A retired teacher paid for me to go, right, become a change agent, be trained in how to become a change agent. I didn't even know what it was then. She liked what I was doing on the local school board, so she paid for me to go. And I was trained to identify the resistors in my community. So whenever, that's just unbelievable. That's like in the Soviet Union or China. You identify resistors. I was being trained to do that. So you got to remember that whenever you see the word change agent, it is a bad, bad, bad word. And I never got over that, and that's probably the major reason that I'm still fighting the way I am about the communist infiltration through the education system. And so we'll go to Marjorie Liddell, who Marjorie got me off onto that definition, which is just as well because it's important. But she's very, very important, high up change agent. Close to William Spady, who is the father basically of outcomes-based, performance-based, results-based education, which is all Skinner, mastery learning, direct instruction. She's very close to all those people, and she works up in Oregon, I believe. But anyway, she was very clear about school choice, and this is what she said. It was in Educational Leadership, I believe, a journal, about 15 years ago. Because this isn't new. I mean, school choice goes all the way back about 50 years. We can get into that later, too. But she said, let's not keep arguing about whether we're going to do OBE or not do OBE. That's outcomes-based ed, right? The real issue that we have to focus on and what we want is publicly funded private education.
Wow.
She said that. And I have, because I picked up some of these documents in my old office in the Department of Ed, I have money that had gone out to various groups, or rather, I have the group's application for funding from my office on John Dewey Society letterhead with all these major left-wing change agents like John Goodlad, et cetera, presenting a proposal for school choice. See, look, they're all in bed together.
Yeah, but how do they? How they must come together under some umbrella of some sort.
I really wonder. I think that the Committee for Economic Development is a very important one, CED. If you go in there, you'll see a lot of these names all mixed together. They've got so many different alphabet soup organizations, et cetera, that, but you're right. Sometimes I wonder where are, take Arne Duncan, for instance, who's the left-wing Secretary of Education under Obama. Let's just say Obama's Secretary of Education agrees with the Heritage Foundation. Now, look, how many people out there listening to me, or they probably think that I've had too much to drink.
Well, I doubt that, but my point, Charlotte, is that there must be some methodology for coordinating all of these different intangibles into a focused effort at the end. There's somebody, somehow, some way, there's a maestro behind this orchestra, right?
Well, I think that it's been a gradual change in the behavior and the views and all. It's sort of conditioning through, and I do want to go through this later. I call it the devil's seven-pronged fork. That's something I really want to discuss because it does help people understand what's happening. But it's been this gradual conditioning that if you go through, say, the Carnegie thing, we'll go back to that, the School to Work agenda for the planned economy, what was planned in 1934. Well, yeah, I mean, you have to remember that there were the congressional investigation of the tax-exempt foundations in 1953. So that was, 20 years after Carnegie's agenda was spelled out in that little book. And this was an investigation of communism, basically. Most of it really had to do with education. And I knew Norman Dodd, the great Norman Dodd, whose video is available with Ed Griffin at realityzone.com, the interview that Griffin gave Norman Dodd. And also I had dinner with Norman Dodd down in Georgetown in the early 80s. That was the most extraordinary dinner I ever had. I mentioned to people earlier about, when I was taught how to identify resistors, that was what got me going. Well, when Norman Dodd looked at me across the dinner table in a restaurant in Georgetown and told me that part of the investigation, he had to go up to New York City and meet with the president of the Ford Foundation, Rowan Gaither, and in regard to the investigation, because it was investigation of tax exempts. And Gaither, answered him, Mr. Dodd, we get our instructions on how to spend our money from the White House. And those instructions are to spend our money so that we can bring about a comfortable merger of the United States with the Soviet Union. And you see, we must never forget this. We must never forget that, because I can talk about 1934 with Carnegie saying that we're going to change the United States free market system, right, to a planned economy. Planned economy is the communist system. And people can say, oh, well. Yeah. But then when you've got that admission to Norman Dodd in 1953, and then the continuation of these policies coming all the way through with Reagan signing the agreements with the Soviet Union and Carnegie doing so, and then putting in the school to work agenda, which George Bush is doing, and then under Reagan, something that appeared to be very strange to me. I was appointed liaison with the White House on what was known as President Reagan's private sector initiative. My boss appointed me out of my Office of Educational Research and Improvement. That was a big mistake he made, appointing me. But I went over there, and I saw what they were doing. There was this whole, I've got all the names of the churches, the companies. Roger, you just asked me where these people meet and how do they, what's going on. I really don't know, but I think that there's got to be a lot of meetings going on. Anyway, this list of corporations, different organizations and churches, etc., but mainly corporations, merging them with the government. And I remember Wendy Borchert was a lovely person working in the White House. She was a Reagan appointee, very nice woman. And I said, Wendy, I don't understand. What is going on here? Merging the public and private sector? Isn't that, the best thing you could call that, isn't that corporate fascism?
Yes, it is. And
she said, well, Charlotte, I don't know that anybody has looked at it that way. And I said, well, I wasn't highly educated at all, but I guess I'd traveled enough to know, that wasn't the way we were meant to go. And so shortly thereafter, there appeared an article in the Washington Post in regard to President Reagan setting up a White House task force on the economy. And all of this is in my book, folks, Deliberate Dumbing Down. And the focus was to change our free enterprise system and not to be so rigid about our free enterprise system, and that we should have partnerships with the government, and we should adopt the Japanese system. Now, this is what President Reagan allowed to have happen, or spearheaded. I don't know. He had Ed Meese was on that commission, Caspar Weinberger, and so we go through that. Now, that was necessary. If you think in terms of charter schools could never have happened. Couldn't be happening right now if Reagan had not put that public-private partnership system in place. Now, we never voted on that in the United States Congress. It's really interesting how these things just evolve. So the corporation...
Whoa, don't just run past that point. Wait just a second here. Are you saying that all of this NGO stuff and these public-private partnerships and all this stuff is just done by presidential edict? There's no law or legislation supporting any of it?
Well, I don't think there is. Maybe I don't know, but I know one thing. that the Chamber of Commerce, the National Chamber of Commerce, was a strong supporter of the United Nations, which means it would be a strong supporter of regionalism and a strong supporter of public-private partnerships, because this is all the same thing. Now, I don't believe that there's ever been. It's really interesting. You see, Roger? We don't really have anything in the Constitution that says that you can't do this. I just think that the United States, we've always operated on the premise that a free market system is the best way to go.
Right.
Is there anything in the Constitution, or I've thought about this a bit, but in the past, and I've often thought, is there anything there that says you can't do that? So in a way, what Reagan did, I don't know whether it was unconstitutional or not. I'd say that it certainly was un-American.
Yeah, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to have government and private industry partnered. Although I think there are things that private industry can do a lot better than government, obviously.
Yeah.
But this weird kind of partnership thing just never made any sense to me, because it doesn't fit with our just even the folklore of history. Nothing in American history is as best I can tell from reading a multitude of history books, nothing there that represents this kind of relationship. And
I think you're absolutely correct. And you know what's interesting here is, and I run into discussions with people who support, charter schools and school choice and all on this, is that the delineation between the government and the private sector is extremely important due to one thing, and that is government requires elected officials to make decisions. See?
Right.
It's a matter of accountability. And it's just like with, say, charter schools. Bill Bennett has a virtual academy, computer curriculum that homeschoolers use.
Yes.
And, boy, the homeschoolers are really smart. They're smart. Well, you're smart if you homeschool. They asked him, because he was trying to sell his virtual academy to the homeschoolers. They said, well, Secretary Bennett, what test are you going to administer to our children? And he said, well, we have to administer the national test. And they said, oh, and he said, well, yes, because charter schools are tax-supported, federally funded. So, in other words, that means that a charter school, a homeschooler using it, will have to take the national assessment, which is 60% probably politically correct. That means, in the environment, sustainable development, know God, love the UN, all that stuff, huh? And this is the key right here. And then people will say, well, that's not fair that the government requires the schools to administer the national test. And I say, I think it's fair. Look, if you decide to, and I never voted for federal money when I was on a local school board, right? If you decide to vote for federal money, if you want the money, you are going to have to conform your behavior in your school, in your home, your whatever, to what the criteria are in the regulations for that particular funding. And that makes perfect sense, because we all pay taxes, and the federal government has to represent all of us. So it has regulations. If you don't like them, don't take the money. This is the way our form of government operates, and I'm totally in agreement with it. I'm not in agreement. That's why I used to vote against all these programs, right?
Right.
But if you're going to take the money, you are going to have to conform. Now, Chester Finn, who's very much in favor of this, he's with Fordham and with the neocons, and he's been, involved as a major change agent ever since he worked first for Moynihan, way back, Senator Moynihan. And then he was assistant secretary after I left my office. He became assistant secretary, and I know him. But there was a time when Chester, and this is in my books, et cetera, but where he said that, as far as school choice is concerned, and tax support, giving tax money to the private sector, religious schools or charter schools or whatever, he said, short of throwing money in the streets and letting everybody come in and grab, as much as they possibly can and run away and hide, there is no way for the recipient of that money to not have to be accountable to what the federal government wants.
Right.
Now, that's what he said back then.
Right, and I think we see this, and it's probably part and parcel of the conditioning that we've been forced to endure. But you see it now across a wide spectrum of government programs. In other words, environmental planning, land use planning,
absolutely,
water management, forest management. It just goes on and on and on. But it's a similar concept where more and more and more the Washington money is the string, the wire, the connector to a myriad of legislative proposals or conditions at the local level.
Absolutely.
So we've completely lost any kind of local control.
Well, and that is exactly it is happening and has happened whenever there has been a program. I think that we found out about this connection, strong connection, earlier on with, I think it was daycare, for funding of daycare. And we've got that legislation. I think I have it somewhere in my book. We had some good researchers doing it, Ginny Baker and some others on school choice, and they would go back to that particular law on daycare about the regulations. You have to, if you have a daycare center in your house and you take federal money, you can't have Bibles around. You've got to have all sorts of everything that the government wants, or you're cut off. So this is, Mary, you're right. American people have been conditioned to sort of believe that they can just take or receive the money without any strings attached. And that's not true. I know it by people probably when I say that I am totally in agreement with those strings being attached.
Right.
I wouldn't take the money, but I think the government has every right to attach the strings, even though I don't like them.
Right. Well, no, I mean, it's a moral argument. In other words, do I have a right if drug testing is the wave in the private sector, and you come to me and you want government assistance, do I have the right to drug test you? I mean, it's an interesting conundrum that we're dealing with in a number of areas in our civilization right now. If you're going to take from the taxpayers' treasury, you've got to expect some kind of strings, don't you? I mean, I think.
Yes, and this is what people, they just don't understand, and what makes them think that they can have these charter schools. And right now, they appear to be sort of benign, but not. They won't be for long. And they're, I suspect that. The funding is very interesting. How it's going. The funding discussions are beginning to start now, and I think that. I know one thing, that the funding, because who was supposed to be a really good guy, we've worked so hard to get him in, but Heritage Foundation had gotten a hold of some people in Maine, and they'd formed this group, and they even before LePage was elected, they had trained or groomed the young man who was going to become Secretary of Education in the state of Maine, Commissioner, and so our governor, we just couldn't believe what he was recommending. He was recommending that, I think he's even recommended that we rescind the restriction of the state of Maine Treasury to funding of religious schools. We rescind that so that the state tax money can go to religious schools. He's all in favor of school to work. He's all in favor of charter schools. I explained everything to him before he was elected. He didn't listen at all. And so what he's recommended really, woke me up a bit. And when he said that the money, which we have been watching for a long time, like 30 years, we researchers, the money will follow the child. The individual child. You will not have schools funded as they have been in the past. The whole school, right? K through 12, the old hierarchical structure, that we had. They want to crash that. And really, that was the only good thing that I could think about that education had, because, it has right now, because the curriculum has just been destroyed, the academic curriculum. But the system itself was very good. We paid our taxes, went to the individual school. Each child had a certain amount spent on them, but they didn't have individual education plans, which is what's going in right now. Each child has his own plan. There are no grades. There will be no grades, A through, F. No kindergarten through 12th grade anymore. You're going to be able to graduate at 14 or 21. You see, this is the workforce training. This is what I'm talking about. Carnegie laid out the plan in 1934, and everything that I've discussed so far, right? The UN, and then the Education Commission of the States, the National Assessment, the merger of the public and private sector, the agreements with the Soviet Union, the school to work being put in now. Now, all of this had to happen in order to implement school choice. And it is really extraordinary how our poor people out there, I understand, and I want to do that devil's seven-pronged fork thing too, one of these minutes that we come up on, it's hard for them to understand how serious this situation is, and that it was very carefully planned right from the get-go by the Carnegie Corporation, probably the other foundations as well. I sure don't want to let them off the hook, like Ford and Rockefeller and Mott and Gates later on, right, and all these corporations. But it is very clear that the roadmap, they never deviated from any of these signposts that I've tried to lay out to bring us to the point right now, including the fact that our children have been so dumbed down, and the parents, and actually it's at the point now where it's grandparents, because they didn't get what they were supposed to be getting on purpose, deliberate dumbing down, because you could never have put this system in and not had people screaming and yelling unless the people had been conditioned to accept what these change agents were, and the teachers being retrained to impose this new philosophy of the group. The group is more important than the individual, and it's not fair. Some of these educators, believe it or not, one of them, what's his name? James Block is a quote in my little Back to Basics. He's high up change agent. He said, it's not fair that some children should do better than other children. We've all got to, really basically just redistribution of brains. And so with that mentality out there running the education system, and he's high up, James Block, mastery learning, big direct instruction guy. Of course, the conservatives all fall into the Skinner method. They love it, I guess, for reading. But anyway, he was a big mastery learning direct instruction person. And he said it's just not fair for some students to do well and others not. So we've got to drag the whole system down so everybody does okay. Minus okay, huh? So anyway, that's what's happened, and we are now at that point, and with a bad economy and all, boy, they've really got it going good for them, huh? Well, excuse me. How could they, they really are in the catbird seat. They can pretty well get the American people to jump on board any program that says this is going to help your child get a job. They don't use the word training that much, huh? Help your child get a job, and they don't go, of course, never let people know it was deliberate. People, well, the word job, hey, wouldn't it be wonderful if our young people and all the people who are out of jobs and older people who've lost their jobs and whatever could find work now? I mean, it's a horrible situation, and of course somebody else should write the deliberate economic catastrophe in America, right? So all of this is working to their advantage. And I can understand. I really can. You know, I was pretty naive in the early 80s. I never would have dreamed that these very people that I almost idolized, I hate to admit it, Roger, you know, I thought William Buckley and, you know, all the Bill Rusher, huh? Well, a lot of people don't know who he is, but nice man. But in the mid-'70s, he was the editor of National Review, and I was fighting regional government, which is communism, identified as communism by a writer for the Communist Daily World. And I was fighting it here in Maine because our governor, or Muskie, was Mr. Metro, they called him. And he used to say that, you know, when we Democrats can't get what we want, we go to the Republicans. Huh? That was way back then. And then Nixon caused the country in 10 regions, right? But anyway, I knew I had that article by this writer for the Communist Daily World, and I asked William Rusher at one of those receptions after the American Conservative Union Conference, or CPAC they call it now, and I said, that I knew him, I said, Bill, what's the problem with the conservative movement? How come Human Events and National Review and ACU never deal with the problem of regional government? And he said, oh, well, Charlotte, I guess they just don't think it's very important.
Oh, Lord.
Huh? How do you like that one? So, yeah. So, in other words, I guess that these wonderful conservative groups that we've all been depending on for so long to save this country, they just don't think communism is very important.
Right.
And
well, you know, we saw an article today out. Breitbart has exposed that Barack Obama not only joined the Socialist Party in Illinois, but actually wanted to seek their nod as their candidate for state senate. So,
wow.
So that just broke today on Breitbart. But yeah. people are not angry or offended today when you say so and so is a communist. They go, oh, that's cool. Does he have a tattoo on his butt? You know, they don't care.
I know.
And I don't know how you deal with that kind of ignorance. That's
I don't either.
Woo, that's powerful stuff to me.
I mean, you and I are trying to do it right now, but the thing is that it's like, you know, you start to talk to someone and then, you know, it's like being at the theater when the curtain comes down.
Yeah, no, when
you're just sitting there looking at the curtain.
When you look at people and they just kind of roll their eyes and go like, okay, so he's a communist, and why am I offended by that? You know, it's like, oh my God, help! I don't know how to communicate with people that are that stupid. I'm sorry.
Well, I live out here on the river, and honestly, I'll tell you one thing: the bald eagles and the wild animals and all, they're just pretty damn smart. I much prefer. I have to get in the car and go shopping or one thing or the other, and Americans are. They are good people, you know, and I'm not saying it's always the case, but, well, it's not always the case. You want to know why? Because I don't bother to talk to them about it anymore. It was the case up until about a year ago when I would, the same thing you're saying, you know, you start talking, you say, well, you know, what are we doing signing those education agreements with communist China, you know, bringing all those students and teachers over here for, and people might say, oh, what? Well, now, oh, no, they figure, well, that's all right because communist China owns us.
Right.
I mean, what
are
you
complaining
about, Charlotte?
Again, pardon my critical thinking without the education-ese attachment to it, but it seems to me that, and you know, we just talked about federal strings attached to money.
Right.
Well, does that not then, I think, make the case that Chinese money has strings attached to it?
I think it has some pretty bloody strings attached.
Right, and so does the average American understand that the policy decisions being made in Washington right now, this is a group of folks who can't even agree to actually cut the budget 1%. They'll cut 1% of their 10% projected growth likely,
right.
But they'll never actually cut any real, definitive cuts will never happen in the federal government with this Congress or the last several Congresses. So the Chinese know that if they are the catalyst for the lending or the buying of T-bills or whatever the circumstances are of about 42% of the budget, and I know that China isn't specifically responsible for that much of the overspending that we do, but it's their confidence that drives other countries to go ahead and invest in the United States. In other words, if Congress, if China said tomorrow, well, we're responsible for about 18% of your borrowing, but you know what, we're going to stop because you guys are making us crazy, then everyone else would back out too.
That's
so
right.
So we would have this instant 42% cut in cash flow. It would be something tantamount to the fall of the Roman Empire.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are really walking on eggs, huh? Eggshells. I mean, I think of it often. I mean, China there's just about nothing that it couldn't do to us. They're in the catbird seat, and so it looks like we're. Sometimes I wonder if maybe these phony conservatives, these neoconservatives that are in bed now with Obama and Arne Duncan and putting in this totalitarian lifelong workforce training slavery system, you just wonder if they're not smarter than we are, and they figured it all out a while ago and just said, well, maybe we better just we'll have communism light.
Charlotte, I have a friend. God bless him. His name is Glenn, and I know he won't mind me saying this, but Glenn is in a situation where he's in a home he hasn't paid a payment on in over 3 years.
Yeah.
And he's dying. I hate to say dying. Please, God, let there be a miracle. But he has stage 4 pancreatic cancer that's metastasized and affected the liver and other organs, plus the lymph nodes.
Oh,
so
poor guy.
The odds of Glenn surviving that are, in human terms, 0.
Yeah.
With divine intervention, anything goes. So, we're praying for a miracle for him. However, he went down and got an insurance policy, and his family's helping him pay the premium. But after the fact, when he was found that he had cancer he was going to die from, potentially, he got insurance that covers the chemo and all the treatments, and they just threw him on. And I mean, I love that. I mean, I love when people see that happen, they think, well, that Obamacare is good stuff,
Yeah.
So people see these little symbols of socialism that affect them or their family or someone they love and care about in a positive way. And they begin to say, well, that's the humanitarian thing to do, to help old Glenn with his cancer. And
well, you know what's happened? I think it's this soft, mushy education that was put in the 60s. How do you feel about everything?
Right.
And there's no logic. Nobody really thinks in terms of the ramifications of what you were just talking about, something. They would never think, well, gee whiz, the guy, so my husband died of prostate cancer about, 4 years ago. And the same thing, when the test came back, the MRI, it was all through his back and et cetera and all. He was a great sport and went down like a trooper and, with a sense of humor saying, boy, he told everybody, you got to give me credit. I sure chose the right time to check out. That was before Obama got elected. Okay. But anyway, he knew. I mean, I knew. I had the MRI. I mean, no way would I ever have, expected, he didn't want chemotherapy anyway, but I never would have expected the government to pay for my husband to have treatments for something that was absolutely terminal. But that's logic. The Americans don't. They have this free and easy attitude. You know, it's all touchy feely, warm fuzzy, and you know we went through that period.
Well, Charlotte, yes, and you know, here when I grew up with a family of folks that didn't have a lot of education, but they had a lot of smarts. My dad has a book out right now called "How Much Schooling Do You Need to Be Completely Stupid?" You know, where he just makes the point that, you know, my grandmother, my father's mother, was a school marm in a one-room schoolhouse with 8 grades or 12 grades.
Yeah.
She managed to get in the morning and get everything set up and get the materials out and get the fire built and get the place warmed up.
Yep.
And then teach kids at a multitude of levels,
Right.
a wide array of topics.
Yep.
And they grew up, you know, with McGuffey readers or whatever the model was at the time. And they walked out of there literate, intelligent people who had substance to their knowledge. And they were great.
Right.
They were greatly educated beyond and ready for college when they walked out of that little one-room schoolhouse. Okay. Today, all these kids, I mean, their career aspirations are rock and roll star or tattoo artist.
Absolutely. You know, I'm glad you mentioned that because we have on the American Deception website. This is interesting because it seems to get more hits than anything else there, but it's probably because it's only 8 pages, right? But people have got to go and, you know, type this in. And you type in the last name, and it's Hignite, Hignite. Okay, this relates to what you were just talking about, the quality of education a little bit back. Now, this was a test on the Constitution that was given to this individual. He was a freshman or eighth, I don't know what grade, but not even senior or anything. In 1953 in Central California, public school, and he got 99 on it. And it is without a doubt one of the most difficult tests I've ever seen. Somebody gave it to me. I was speaking in California, and they said, you know, they poked it. They said, you want this? And I thought, oh, people are always giving me all sorts of stuff, and I'm grateful, but, you know, I have to take it home. And so I looked at it. I got back to the hotel, and I thought, what on earth? How did this Kenny Hignite ever get 99 on this? He had to know all the names of the Supreme Court justices back then. He had to recite the Bill of Rights, the separation of the parts of the government, you name it, what the government's, the Constitution, what it can't do, what it can do, and he gets 99. And
but he had to know 22 amendments to the Constitution, right?
Yes.
Not the first 10, but he had to know 22 of them.
Right, all of them. And so I put it up on the internet. I mean, my son's website. It's there. You can go look at it. Well, it has had something like 35,000 hits.
Wow.
And because people from all over the world are looking at this and saying, I think what they're saying is, gee, you know, I mean, the United States used to have a good education system. What happened? And maybe our own people are looking at it too. And then there are people who will say, oh, well, Kenny's just brilliant. You know, he's a genius. And I say, no, wait a minute. This teacher, she didn't give this just to Kenny. This was a test that she gave to a whole class. And she expected them to know it. And by the way, I did finally find Kenny Hignite. And he called me, and because he's become so famous, right? And he said to me, Charlotte, I'll tell you, that teacher I had in 8th or 9th grade, he said she was the cutest chick you ever saw. And boy, was she hard on us. She didn't allow no funny business at all. But what a wonderful teacher. Now that's this is important for the listeners to hear. 1953 in California. This was what was required of not just Kenny Hignite, that whole class. Public school. So what happened, that was 53. Well, in 1965, then you had the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And that was the beginning of the downfall of American education, because basically they started there. The emphasis was on results, performance, outcomes, no longer the brain, neurological, Pavlovian, Skinnerian education. Performance, and that's why outcomes-based, results-based, performance-based education is all Skinner, Pavlov. I don't care whether they've got it attached to phonics reading or not. It is Pavlov. And there's no brain activity going on. And that happened. I have the first paper, it's in my book, from, I think it's from Phi Delta Kappan, the first paper that was written on performance-based education for teachers. And it says in there, it's a very interesting paper, it talks about how they felt that this had to be the way they were going to go because it was during the civil rights movement, and they wanted everybody to be able to be a teacher, right?
Right.
And so that they changed the teacher training from regular academics that you and I have just been talking about to performance-based, which is necessary. Again, we're looking at, think about Carnegie, 1934. They had to do this in 1965 to change teaching to training, performance, not what you know in your head. And that, the teachers fought it for years because, it took a while for that to drip through the system. Teachers fought it. They didn't like it. And even in that paper by Stanley Elam, that very important paper in my book, he said that the teachers didn't like it because it was Pavlov. So that's what has happened, and that's basically the reason, plus the values clarification, destruction of the morals and values, destruction of absolutes, etc., and the global education emphasis so that, they don't even know they have a constitution, etc. But getting back to Kenny, people be sure to go there. I guess there's something about that test that appeals to everybody who goes to that website. They just they click on it and boom, they tell their friends and it's all over the place. So there's no excuse for what's happened. There's no excuse. There's no excuse at all because it was deliberate. I mean, is that their excuse? Maybe they'd say, oh, well, Charlotte Iserbyt, she says it's deliberate. Maybe they'd say, well, that's true. It is deliberate. That's our excuse. It's deliberate.
Wow.
Is that their excuse? What? I mean, whoa. How many billions and trillions of dollars have we spent on education? Now, this isn't really very nice for me to say because it's rather disgusting, but I always say to try to get through people's head, look, you have a friend, he's a butcher. He's been giving you good hamburger for years. So you get hamburger from him. It's good. Next time you go back, not so good. It's sort of smelly. Then the third time, but you go back again because he's your friend. Third time you go back again, and it is really bad. Now, I ask, do you go back again?
Yeah.
This is the typical American mindset. They will go back again and again and again and again. The test scores, the worse they get, the more money's poured in, because that's the agenda, create the problem, people scream and impose the rotten solution. But they keep going back. It's like they love, what's the word? Are they masochists or something? Maybe. I think they hate themselves, and the way they beat up on themselves is to pay more money for education that keeps failing.
Right. Well, look, as long as the people are silent on this stuff, then they're going to continue to operate with impunity. Now, see, part of the problem for me, Charlotte, is if I get a bad result from my education, public education lets me down. Okay,
yeah.
Who do I turn to? With this perception of sovereign immunity. There's no one to take up my cause. I can't sue the people who ruined my life individually because they've got this artificial shield of protection around them called sovereign immunity. And I think part of the problem for me is, and I know you and I have talked about similar things for years, but part of the problem for me is that I think that if you could sue people for screwing up your life, they'd be less inclined to do it.
Well, but you're right. I mean, it is so difficult to even get to that point. Like we in 1985, I was involved in writing the regulations to carry out the Protection of People's Rights Amendment when I was in the department, and then got out, and then we had those hearings around the country, and they were incredible hearings, and for people to really find out what was going on in the schools then, and of course is the same and worse, they should get child abuse in the classroom. And that's posted at my son's website, AmericanDeception.com, because that's the testimony of teachers and parents to the federal government, talking about sort of what you're talking about, saying, stop it. This is horrible what you've done. You've destroyed my children. These programs are so damaging. These are federally funded programs, all of which I saw in my office. They're all coming out of my office. But so we get the regulations. And actually, the educators were pretty upset. So one of my buddies, a guy, he was in the men's room at D.C., the D.C. hearing on the Protection of People's Rights. One of the top change agents was in the bathroom, washing his hands or something. And this friend of mine, who was a good educator, there are some in the department, he said, Charlotte, he would have just loved what I just heard. This guy was talking, who was actually in my office, this bad guy, was talking to his other friend and saying, whoa, we're in trouble, which meant that, our getting these regulations scared them to death. They were going to have to get rid of all these rotten multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar, values-destroying programs, sex ed, drug ed, bullying ed, you name it, everything with education hanging off the end of it. And he was washing his hands in the men's room right after the hearing. And they were both discussing how they were really in trouble. Well, I'm sorry, folks, I have to tell you that they didn't have anything to worry about. Just as you said, Roger. You go up, we tried, in many states, we've tried to take the Protection of People's Rights Amendment and get them to stop this testing, stop this horrible behavior modification. They always have, I don't know how they manage to get their lobbyists, their people in there. Of course, usually they can always, the bureaucrats, there's some are good, but, they don't have to worry about their hours of work. They can go to these hearings and testify, or go to the Pennsylvania Department of Education hearing on that great case that Anita Hogue took to, and won, believe it or not, she did. We did have one victory. She won against the Pennsylvania Education Quality Assessment. And you know what they did? Oh, this will interest you. It's part of it. This is how they deal with it. She won. And the Federal Department of Education stated that she had won because it was out of the Department of Ed that the regulations were issued, right?
Right.
And she won against the state of Pennsylvania. This horrible assessment that they had, children's attitudes, values, beliefs, do you believe in God, or all these tricky little games and et cetera in the assessment. I mean, that's what we have now, folks, too, if you don't understand what's on your child's assessment. That Bill Bennett said, he has to give the assessment to the homeschoolers for their virtual academy. Hey, folks. But anyway, Anita, she won, and you know what they did, though? So simple. You really wonder, Satan has got to be alive and well. What the Pennsylvania Department of Education did to get around this, they just changed the name of the test.
Wow.
Yeah, well, this is how we work so hard and we try so hard, to stop this stuff. And really, I never really understood how changing the name of the test could get at the problem, which wasn't the title of the test. Anyway, how do we change these things? I honestly don't know, but when we right now, Roger, we do not have, we Americans, except ourselves and our neighbors, if we can inform what's happening, we don't have any organized support for our views. Those groups that we counted on in the past, and I have to admit that I was very naive myself until quite recently, they have not been with us. Now, it doesn't mean that they're 100% evil people, but there's an example that I have to mention in regard to school choice, and that is in 1995, I wrote to an individual I considered a really good friend and worker. It was Phyllis Schlafly at Eagle Forum. And I've worked very hard with Phyllis through the years, and I even helped her with that great book, Child Abuse in the Classroom, and I helped her with a lot of education issues, and I had high regard for her work on the Equal Rights Amendment and stuff like that. And I was so upset because it seemed that our people out in the state of Washington in particular who were fighting charter schools, she had some good eagles out there who were fighting charter schools in the state of Washington. I'll tell you, the state of Washington was so bad. And the documents that I'm going to refer to in regard to this correspondence with Phyllis are at my son's website, AmericanDeception.com. All you have to do is type in the name Iserbyt Schlafly. And the letter I wrote to Phyllis was a very friendly letter, and I was explaining to her what was going to happen with the charter schools, and the fact about Carnegie that I've talked about with you today, 1934, the plan for planned economy, and the 8-year study, Carnegie again. That was the Progressive Education Association. That was the first outcomes-based experiment. And then just the Soviet Polytech system and how Professor Beck was given, while I was in the department, $4 million to study the Soviet Polytech system. And I gave her all of this information, and I told her that public school choice is the international vehicle to do away with representative form of government through site-based management. And I told her that the NEA and top education change agents, including Dennis Doyle, Finn, Bennett, etc., are working with Rockefeller, Benjamin Bloom, Ted Sizer, the late Sizer, McGeorge Bundy, etc., and that these people that we consider on the left, the end of that group of people, they support choice charter schools since they know that they and the multinational corporations are working with the teachers. They will then run the schools and won't have to worry about unruly school board members, controversy of budget time, and resistance to bond issues. That is the reason for charter schools. Now, I told her that. I told her all of this. And I told her about what was going on, trying to get rid of representative government, and the different individuals who were involved in this. There was a letter to Reagan from what's his name? I can't remember right at the moment, but from Kansas, talking about doing away with elected officials. So we don't need it now that we have computers. And I told her everything, changing governance and education, etc. And I never heard from her. And I attached all these documents, including the letter, I just remember the name of the guy, from Willard Garvey, who was all involved in privatization of everything and on board with all these other names of conservatives that many people have heard of. I sent all of it to her. I asked her, I pled with her to please support the Eagles in the state of Washington who are trying to kill charter schools, because, boy, it was big time out there. They were talking not just about schools having no elected officials. They were into it big time, getting rid of all elected officials and having the council form of government like the Soviet Union. How nice, So you don't have any elected officials, but you have some of these nice people that have been chosen in your community who really are concerned about your problems, and if you have a problem, you call them and you make an appointment and you go over and talk to them. This is what they've had planned. This is the communist system that's going in right now. But they've had to back up, and I have to give people credit. A lot of Americans, including yourself and many other people, I think, the work we've done has not been for naught. You know, we have been highly successful in keeping this freight train from making it through to its destination, a crash.
Well, I think that, you know, when you see the results, for example, of the homeschoolers and how much better prepared they are for life than the public schoolers, and and more and more and more people are signing on to that, and more importantly, the decision makers almost all have their children in private schools.
That's right.
Now, that begins to wear on people. They begin to think, well, wait a minute now. Congressman Dum Dum and his 4 senatorial sisters all have their children in private school, and why is that?
That's a good point. And also, why can't we? And then they fall for charter schools. They think it's a private school. They don't even know that it's federally funded and that it doesn't have an elected board. But you see, they've marketed it so that people really think there's a choice there. It's really, it's just pure evil to do this to the parents who are so distraught over the public school system for every reason. They have every reason to be. And you know how it is, Roger, when things really get bad, sometimes you just want to believe what you want to believe, and you don't want to believe anybody telling you that that's not the way to go, because there isn't any other way to go, huh? There is no other place for these poor parents to go right now. I'm not defending the public school system at all, because of the track record is absolutely horrendous. And but I'm defending the system, the hierarchical system, and basically not just for the children's sake and the teachers' sake to try to get back to an academic system, but because I'm terrified that once this is allowed to happen, where a major hunk of our money, our hard-earned money, is going to support an education system in which we have there is no accountability there to us as taxpayers, because we can't, if something happens with our child, whether it's a school to work thing or whatever, say, you don't have anybody to go to. You don't have a representative. You don't have anybody to go to. What are you going to do? Go to the factory foreman if he cuts his hand off at work, at a school to work site? I mean, it's bad. I mean, we're paying big money for education. And our elected system at least did provide us with representation where, you know, you could go and you could get rid of these people.
Well, Charlotte, in my school district, the budget for the school system right now, over 30% of it goes to pay retired teachers under age 60.
Oh, God.
Okay. Now, think about that. In San Diego, the mayor just came out today announcing a new program to taper back considerably the benefits programs of public employees there, because they just can't afford it. And so,
Yep.
So a lot of the money, and I think this is the frustration that many of the teachers in the classroom have today, a lot of the money that might otherwise be utilized in the classroom is being siphoned off so that young 50-something former teachers can go hang out in the Bahamas and drink rum yummies until they're sick. And so, in my view, if you have this money being leached off the system, and then you have this Soviet-style, kind of anti-contextual education system in place, and you've got teachers who are going, "What in the hell am I teaching?" Yeah. And so now you've got this lack of motivation. And all of these things end up hurting children. I mean, it's a form of child abuse. And I think
that's why the title of Phyllis's book was really marvelous. Child Abuse in the Classroom. And there's so many teachers that know that, and I must say, when I wrote the book, I thought I was going to end up having hate, death threats almost, and it was just the opposite. I mean, I never really had calls from top educators calling me and saying, you've done a wonderful job or anything, but I had a lot of calls from teachers who just said, thank you so much, because I finally realized I'm not crazy. This is what they've been doing. They've been retraining us. They're screwing our heads. They're whatever. And also, occasionally I'd have a superintendent call into a radio talk show, and I was always terrified, right? When the talk show host like you, would say, well, Charlotte, we have a superintendent coming on from Raleigh, North Carolina or something. He wants to talk to you. And I think, oh, heaven help me, I'm going to be blown out of the room. And then he'd get on and he'd say, well, this didn't happen too often, but it happened a few times. I just want all of you listeners to listen. This lady is telling it like it is. And these are, school superintendents.
Right. Well,
there are
my cousin who
many
retired.
more educators out there who are good than many people think, because you just blanket all of them because the result is such a catastrophe that everybody gets swept into the same basket as being a rotten educator who almost hates kids, and that's not true. But, you're going to ask me, and rightfully so, well, what do we do? What do we do? Well,
my cousin who retired from Ashland, Oregon public school system, sadly met his demise through a botched surgery, but he was a great economics and political science teacher. He really was an awesome guy.
Yep.
And he said to me, Raj, I can't even discipline in my classroom because if I discipline in my classroom, I have to go to an administrative inquisition in every single event. And it's always the parents and the administrators and the kid against me.
That's right.
And so he said, I can't control that because that's the management style of the administration in most public schools now. The kids and the parents are right, and you, the dumb teacher, are a moron. Shut up, and you shouldn't have done it.
You're absolutely correct, and it's no wonder. I often wonder exactly, maybe with, on the internet you can find just about anything. If I typed in number of nervous breakdowns or depression of school principals, and what would pop up, because I know myself, having been involved since the early 70s and being on a local board and starting an education group in my state, there were 3 really good principals that I knew, one in our own school district, that I was on the local board there. They had nervous breakdowns, and they quit. Now, if I, Charlotte, knew 3 just in the 1970s, can you imagine how many there must be across the country that all had nervous breakdowns and quit? They couldn't deal with it any longer, having their minds scrambled, because what they do at the training for these principals are all to retrain them. All this is out of the National Training Laboratories, NTL, that came out of the OSS, and we had the first National Training Lab was in Bethel, Maine. This is where they pull all the good teachers and superintendents or whatever, principals into the group, and they still do it. And they put them through the group process, which is all Chinese communist thought control stuff, in order to try to change their attitudes and values, because basically most of these teachers and principals that go in there, they went in with the same values that you and I, Roger, have, right?
Yes.
They tried to do that to me when I went to the change agent training. Here I was being taught to identify myself because I was a resistor. They didn't know.
I know all about being a resistor, and you saved my behind once. So I owe you. I had to go meet with Norma Paulus at the time and a bunch of folks at the local newspaper because I was using your information to tear down their hokey pokey certificates of mastery, outcome-based education nonsense. And, I made them so angry just asking questions based on what was in your book that one of the guys who was there was, part of the group of brainwashers. He owned the Statesman Journal, which was the state capital newspaper. And he went back to Salem and he wrote a double truck. I mean, 2 full pages in the center of the newspaper about what a SOB I was, and people like me for not, adapting and adjusting to this great new educational concept, and how I was a terrible guy and wrongly informing and misinforming my audience. And he just had example after example after example, and it was all just a bunch of BS. But they've got the media on their side.
Oh, yes. Roger, you'll never believe me, but we finally moved from Camden, Maine, which is really the most extraordinarily liberal place. The liberals always go to the most beautiful places, right? You know that, living out where you are. But anyway, I was so detested because I believed in the 3 R's, and I believed in just normal things, and on the local board, I would vote against federal funding. I got rid of values classification. I did all these nasty things that Charlotte did. Well, for 20 years, but it got better at the end because I wasn't even elected official. But when I was on the board, I could count on at least once every 3 months there would be a picture of me. Luckily, they only had one picture, and it was a good one. But there'd be a picture of me on the front page and how I hated children. And this went on for years until finally, when I got out of the Department of Ed and came home, they still hated me. So if I'd go to a school board meeting or something, they'd all boo me the minute I would walk in. I mean, a budget meeting, but a budget meeting. So for that many years, I just finally we left, and I was able to sort of pull myself up by the bootstraps, and I went and wrote the book. I went to Washington and wrote the book, and everything. I mean, why would I write a book like that? I mean, you used some of the stuff when you were fighting that stuff out of state. Why on earth would anybody bother to write a book like that and collect all that research unless it was true? I mean, what a waste of time.
Well,
I don't think it was a waste of time at all because, even after I'm gone and after all of us are gone, that book is there and it is on the Internet and it is a free download, and it has been for the past 8 years. We made it a free download, so for people who couldn't afford the big baby, they could go and read it, and you can read everything right there on the Internet.
Wow.
But you have to, when you see, you've seen it, I've seen it, when you see children and teachers and principals being destroyed. I mean, isn't that evil?
Well, but for me, when you start aborting the minds of children in first grade, something's wrong. I mean, to me, it's child.
It is so wrong. And what they're doing now with the Skinner method, and Kelly's fighting that thing down in Knoxville. Oh my goodness! I'm glad it's coming to a head. This is the reading instruction. Let's go after the neoconservatives again. In the mid-'90s, they were responsible for putting the stamp of approval on the Skinner method to teach reading, which is called Mastery Reading Direct Instruction. And it was really good. We were able to get a video, and I didn't get it. We just went to the Association for Direct Instruction, and they have a teacher training video there. Everybody should look at that and watch that teacher training video, because they're going to see how your children, these little children, are being talk about child abuse, talk about mental, neurological, moral abuse in the classroom. And little children, they don't know what's happening to them. They're being conditioned like animals. And this is the reading program that was supported and passed due to the neoconservatives. It was called the Reading Excellence Act. It went to the Congress in the mid-'90s under George Bush. It was all this horrible reading instruction. It was mostly in Texas in the beginning, then across the country. Now Kelly's getting it down there in Knoxville. They're putting it in for all the children. And I've been sending her every bit of research I can. And I think it's very important that we're talking about this right now because there's nothing more important than this, Roger. You know, even if they don't get Shakespeare, and even if they don't have any history or math skills or anything, those things are very, very important. But there is nothing more important than this evil system that denies these children their soul.
Yes.
They're being trained like animals without a soul, a conscience. They're being conditioned never to respond except the way the government wants them to respond. Watch that video, folks. That go to the Association for Direct Instruction. Just Google it, and then you'll see teacher training videos and watch it. It'll take you about half an hour. Just sit there and watch what the teachers are being trained to do with the little children, and all the way through now, because this is the method that works with a computer. There's no other method that really, teaching method or training method that works with a computer except Skinner. And he called it his box. Skinner's box. And we lost the great late Jeb Brown, who was the teacher who understood this because he got his degree in behavioral psychology, and he had his pet pigeons, I think, for several years that he trained. His work is on the internet too. You can watch Jeb Brown. This is no joke, folks. The method of teaching, I know you probably never even thought that there was a problem with how do people teach. You probably always assumed it was the way you were taught. No. This is necessary for workforce training. It has nothing, zero, to do with your child's upward mobility, your child's ability to make a decision on its own, to think, to have a conscience, to take a stand when something is right or wrong. No, this is a training method that denies free will, and it is very dangerous. And it is more dangerous than anything else that we have discussed on this program. But it is terribly dangerous because it is the method that is going to be used in the charter schools and already is being used.
I remember
it's essential for workforce training.
I remember in the maybe it was the late 90s, early 2000s. I was on air and there was a story that broke out of Connecticut. And it was about a man who was denied an opportunity to be a police officer because his IQ was too high. And I remember following that story and then realizing that there were many of those stories from around the country. And then ultimately, police hiring agencies admitted that they looked for guys to police us that had an under 100 IQ, preferably around 92, 93. And the reason for that was that they were more adaptable to the training. Yep. And that a police officer, and this may very well be true, but that their life depends on their acclimation to the training. Yeah. And public safety depends on their acclimation to training, which is why they give an ASVAB test for the military to determine which people are going to properly adapt to the training. Yep. And then they begin to condition those people to the training so that, I mean, just to give an example outside of the school system where this is done on a regular basis. And once those folks are conditioned to their training, they live in that world. That's their mindset.
That's right.
And so that's what we're doing to our kids is we're saying, okay, we're going to condition you to fit into this little box, and you're not to go outside the boundaries of the box.
Exactly.
And so you may remember the little exercise with the 9 dots on a page, and you're to connect them all without lifting the pen off the paper with so many straight lines, right? And it's a test of whether or not you're willing to go outside the box in your thinking to solve a problem. And we're actually intentionally teaching kids to stay inside the box.
That's absolutely true, and you know that kind of education was what I was talking about. Anita Hogg's case in Pennsylvania, the education quality assessment. That's exactly what her son ran up against, and he got all the documents, and she used all that for the assessment and the brainwashing that was going on. And it's very similar to what you were talking about. And, you know, you can't get the original film anymore. I don't know if you ever saw the film by Kurt Vonnegut called Harris and Bergeron.
No.
You didn't?
No.
Oh my goodness, what a wonderful film. It was a short story that he wrote, and he was Canadian, I guess. And we got a hold of the video about 20 years ago. And it's what you're talking about. I mean, Harrison is brilliant young man, child in school, huh? And he's so bright that they who want to condition everybody to be at the lowest level, they put these like headphones on his head that clamp against his head as tight as possible. And so the purpose is to make him less bright. So when he does well, and he usually does quite well, the teacher comes by and she checks, he said he's been too smart that day, answering questions. So she comes and she tightens it, and so hoping that that'll make him less smart. And, and every day she comes back and she doesn't get anywhere with him. And then he ends up, to make a long story short, it's a wonderful film, sort of being the head of the propaganda machine at the international level. Christopher Plummer is in the film too. And there's a lot in between that's fascinating too, but I'm not going to go into great detail. But he ends up being required to lie in the media. See, it's this big station up in the clouds or something, global, and he's meant to lie to people, and he refuses. And he goes up against them, and they kill him. But so the film. Some people have it. I have the VCR, and they made another one, a second version, which is nothing like the first one. Doesn't have any of the message of the first one. Evidently, it was just too powerful, and they don't want the American people to see this thing. So I did find my copy the other day. I have a friend who's making 10 copies for me, I think, in DVD.
Right.
And I just start getting that thing. I can't sell it, obviously, but I don't think there's any copyright problem for if I give it to people, is it?
I don't know that there would be. I mean, maybe we could take some excerpts out of it and put it up on YouTube.
I think so. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah,
I'm sure Vonnegut would love it. He's gone now.
Yeah.
But it is an extraordinary. I'll send you a DVD, Roger.
Right.
Because it's exactly what's happening now. And, it really is. I mean, you're talking about the conditioning. We have, I always seem to end up living in places where, sort of in quotes, interesting things are going on. But my last town, and this town too, I mentioned both. My last town where I lived, Bath, Maine, they had the community-oriented policing system. And so they're so proud of themselves because I think they're number one in the country. And they have their training at the police academy up in Augusta. And so if someone does a good deed, say, Roger, you're walking down the street in Bath, Maine, lovely town, Bath, Maine, and you see an old lady who's, dropped all her groceries on the pavement, and you go up and you pick them up and you help her and everything else. A police officer pops out from nowhere and he says, "Oh, done such a good deed. Here's a medal for you." Yeah.
The Good Citizen Award, huh?
I'm not kidding. They have that. And what
Here's your little gold star, Johnny.
What's that?
Here's your little gold star, Johnny.
Oh, yes, or cookie or candy. But they keep a record in the state computer of who does good deeds. Now, you know very well they keep a record of people like myself, too, because I wrote a letter to the paper about it. So I'm sure my name is in the computer. I'm the one who does the bad deeds. But they're keeping records in the computer, the community-oriented policing system. And, so this is what, they started that in the schools. the way they got into the schools was through the DARE program, which was the Drug and Alcohol Resistance Education, federally by Justice Department.
Oh, yeah. I remember my daughter coming home from school and saying, "Oh, you're a drug addict." And I said, "I am. I don't use drugs." She says, "Well, you have a beer." And I said,
"Yeah, you're right." And that's exactly what was happening. And that was a real brainwash program for the children and had nothing to do with, none of these programs have ever had anything to do with helping your children. I mean, I'm getting, off the subject of charter schools and everything. I'm going back to my old subject, change agents, huh? I found that out when I got a hold of the guidance counselor's publication, issue on death. It's just amazing what they will admit when they don't think anybody's going to read their stuff.
What, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stuff?
What's
You're
that?
talking about the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stuff?
Yes, I am. Yes. I am. I'm talking about that. They even mentioned that in this issue of it was a special edition devoted to death education of the Guidance Counselor's Journal. And I got a hold of it, and it said in there, this helps folks understand how these programs, drug and alcohol, bullying, sex ed, all these programs that have nothing to do with alcohol education, have nothing to do with helping your children, have nothing to do. They're geared only to change your children's values, and this quote is dynamite. And they said right in the Guidance Counselor's Journal, "We will use death education to change the students' views towards death and dying, the same way we used sex education to change their values in regard to sex and various sexual practices."
Yeah, well, that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she's the mother of invention when it comes to death education. These people are all lunatics, I'm telling you.
Well, they are, but I mean, think of the money that has gone in over the past 40 years on sex ed, drug and alcohol education, bullying education, death education, all these programs. Just think of the money alone, even if you don't care about the fact that the programs were designed to destroy your children's values.
Well, when I was a kid, my principal and the vice principal, the dean, and some of the teachers were charged with bullying control, and they had a thing called an oak paddle.
Yeah,
and it really did I think work more effectively than the brainwashing.
Well, the brainwashing is simply to make the children worse. It is to create the very problem they've told the parents that the program is going to help. They tell the parents it's to help your child get off sex, get off drugs, get off, whatever. They tell them that, and actually the goal of the program is to create immorality. Because the public school system is the philosophy there. This does get me, because I'm not happy with charter schools that are teaching Sharia law or the Muslim influence in charter schools or anywhere for that matter. But you know what I like to ask people? Where has everybody been the past 50 years or so, with the American public school system, which the goal there is to destroy Christian values and to implement the religion of secular humanism.
Yep.
And that has been defined, secular humanism, as a religion by the Supreme Court. Now, why are they not just as upset about secular humanism as they are about Sharia law, Islam? Now, I know that it's horrible, Sharia law, and I don't go for it. I'm not defending it, right? But I'm saying, where are you folks?
Charlotte, I went to the Southern Baptist Convention to try and encourage them, it's been a decade ago now, to push for homeschooling for Christian families.
Yeah.
That it was really counterintuitive anymore to have your children in a school system that teaches that your religion is, some kind of a twisted fantasy, make believe, a fallacy, a fraud, and that this other religion of Darwinism and the environmentalist, wacko, extremist, Mother Earth Gaia crap, that's the good stuff now, and they really do screw with the minds of children. And what's really interesting to me is now there's a strong contingent of Christians who have signed on to the Green Movement.
Well, yeah, and they, Kelly knows all about it. The publisher of my book, Sarah Leslie, she's absolutely brilliant. She's done the work on Peter Drucker and Rick Warren, Purpose-Driven Church, and Drucker going in there, he's a big, he's sort of the equivalent of Soros in a way. I mean, really bad news. And gone in and trained all the ministers in the evangelical community with purpose-driven religion. Now, purpose-driven is the same as outcomes, results, performance, purpose. It's the same system that is being put into the schools that is going to go into the churches. So everything will be melded together on the computer. There will be no problem whatsoever, because it's the exact same system going into the churches that I have been discussing today in regard to education. The computer in your town will be in the school, right? Which will be a charter school, the unelected board and everything, and the superintendent will be supervising all activities, birth through death. And that will be church and hospital activities and abortions, school to work. Everything will be under the umbrella of the unelected council school district. And actually, this is interesting, because in that thing I sent to Phyllis Schlafly about charter schools, the Washington Education Association discusses, they support charter schools. They discuss this new agenda for America with the unelected councils and everything, lifelong, and the money following the child into whatever occupation they're going to have wherever. This is really very, very important for people to understand. This is the international system. Every facet of our lives, religion, sports, education, workforce, medicine, etc., will all be incorporated in the same computer with a planning, programming, budgeting, management system, etc. And people like Drucker, Peter Drucker, and Leontiev came from Russia to devise the system. Vasily Leontiev. That's the system, and we will be under it, and with no way to complain, because it will be all on the computer. Everything will. Yes, and this is, it is such a horrible scenario that I know people listening, they're just, I think it's perfectly horrible, and it shocks me, and I'm talking about it, and I've been studying it for years. I hate to think what the effect is on people who are listening to this. And I apologize to them. I truly do. And I say the only way really to deal with it is, if you're Christian, you know that this is just a pinprick in history, right? Right here we are. And we have to do what we have to do. And no matter what happens, we're not going to let ourselves get conditioned so that we accept this. And we have to believe in Almighty God and that He has a plan, and that we're part of it. And we have to do something. We have to stop the destruction of the human soul and the destruction of the conscience of these young people and their teachers. This has to be stopped. This is evil. This is the most utmost evil. It's much more evil than not teaching math.
Right. Well, I mean, that's why I call it child abuse. I don't know if you can ever get that label to stick with these people, but to me, it would seem like we should try.
Well, you know what I think? They've used that label so much that, and usually it's in regard to parents. We're all very abusive of our children, right? That people have become desensitized to the importance of that label. I think that, I don't know, we have to come up with another label, because you hear that word, and I often think to myself, well, you know, they're always going after the parents. For instance, right? I mean, if a parent, if your teenager uses a 4-letter word with you, and you smack him like I did once with mine, he's now 45, and he thanks me for it, huh?
Right.
But I would have been, if it had been around now, you know, he could have gone to the school and said that his mom smacked him. And I would be called in for abuse. And that's why I think the word child abuse has lost its meaning.
Right.
There's another word, you know, it's to destroy a soul.
Right.
You know, that really is scary stuff.
Well, that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, you know, I mean, they're leading kids away from their Christian upbringings, away from the all-American kind of thinking of a patriarchal society.
That's right.
And we're literally we moved beyond from patriarchal to matriarchal to a heresiarchal society. It's heresy. It's outright heresy.
And you know, Roger, even with people who don't, you know, who are agnostic, or even with atheists, you know, even with the communists, you know, what's going on right now is so sick. What we're all being told is normal and everything, that I'm sure that as much study I've done of the communist system, you know, the atheists, right? This sort of behavior is not tolerated, or at least it didn't used to be. There was in the mind, even, you know, going back to Greece and Rome, you go back to Aristotle and Socrates and all, there were certain things that were not allowed, even before Christianity. And that's really just sort of common sense.
Right. Well, when I read the Bible, I don't just see a book that's about this promise of salvation and eternal life with Jesus Christ, but I see a book that tells you how to interact with other people, how to develop relationships, how to conduct business, how to protect your health and well-being and your general outlook of life, how to protect your psyche and you know and how to you know kind of live a good life. And so if you use the Bible just as a teaching tool on how to live a good, happy life, a healthy life. Yeah. And people don't care about common sense now.
No,
you know?
they don't. They don't. I mean, if truly anybody who believes that 1 and 1 is 2, you know, if you're in an educational change agent environment, you know, you're going to be thrown out of the room.
Yeah, and I mean, I know everybody harkens back to the 1984 book, and you know Orwell's 2 + 2 = 5, and but that is what's happening. I mean, we have people, you know. I like, for example, I like the green environmentalist whack jobs to get in front of me and start telling me how the ice caps are melting. We're all going to die, you know. And I say to them, okay, well, let me ask you something. Let's just take a look. Let's just put everything you believe in aside for a second and listen to what I have to say here. In places where we do have meltbacks of glaciers and ice caps and such, beneath those layers and sometimes, you know, many thousands or who knows how many hundreds of thousands of years or layers of ice is plant life, abundant grasses and flowers. And as soon as the ice melts back, these things pop up. How did they get there?
Right.
And they go, huh? Well, I mean, the ice had to not be there at some point along the way for them to get there. So explain to me how they got there. It couldn't have been SUVs warming the planet. What must it have been?
Exactly.
And you know, they can't rationalize common sense.
Well,
you know,
they can't think, they're incapable of thinking anymore because it really is, and I sometimes wonder if there hasn't been more of this than I realize. It's a conditioning using Skinner And I think they've had an awful lot of that, and that, it bypasses the brain. The brain doesn't have to function with that kind of conditioning.
Right.
And I notice that what you're talking about, say these people you're talking about, they learned something about ice cap formation, 2 weeks ago. They're unable, 2 weeks later, to pick up on that and add information to it.
Right.
There's no transfer being made. Whatever they learn just seems to stay in one place, and it doesn't connect with any new information. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Absolutely. That's right. I mean, and that's because they don't have any intuition. It's been trained out of them.
That's right. They've been, and this is, and wait until all education, and it will be very soon, is on the computer. And I'm not talking about the terrific use of the computer to learn, because don't we all do that, huh? There's marvelous stuff that you can learn on the computer. I'm talking about what Jeb Bush, excuse me, poor Jeb Brown, excuse me, dear late Jeb Brown, for saying that. Jeb Brown understood this, right? I do. A lot of us do. The computer using the Skinner method. This is what our children are going to have for, that's the future of education. Books, no more books. And I'm not kidding, folks. No more books. And there's this quote, which is such a dynamite quote from the president of the World Institute for Computer-Assisted Teaching about 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, Dustin Houston. This quote is in my book on the internet, and in my new little book, all the quotes are in there too. Dustin Houston said, "Won't it be wonderful when the child in the most remote area of the country can have the benefit of the world's finest psychologists' views, etc., on the computer, and nobody can get between the computer and your child." Isn't that scary?
It's already happening, and look what they've done. I want you to just put that in context a minute with this texting crisis we have in America today.
Oh.
The kids are so addicted to the texting that they're doing it when driving and killing each other.
Yeah.
I mean, it's insanity. And I would never, and I mean, it's easy to say this now. My kids are grown, but I don't think I would have let my kids have a cell phone.
Never. I wouldn't, and I think that as I told you, my son is now living in Grenada. And
I know. I'm extremely jealous.
Extraordinary, wonderful stories from him. He's only been there 2 weeks, and he said, "Mom, boy, I'll tell you, it's so nice. I mean, everybody doesn't walk along the street. They only have 100,000 people there, but they're not all talking on their cell phone. They're not all texting. They're actually communicating with one another down at the fish market or at the beach, or the taxi drivers, or they'll stop and pick someone up who they probably never saw before, who needs help. He said it's just a totally different environment, and he said, he said, I'd been down there and I always liked it, but he said, every day I just feel like a new person. It's like I've moved back into where we all should be.
Really?
And so I'm just so happy about that. And it's tragic. The technology. There's a role for technology, and we all know that we can use it, and it's been helpful. It's all, but it's gotten to the point now where the acceptance of it across the board, whether it's Facebook or I hear Facebook. I'm so glad Facebook went flying through the floor. I wish it would just shut down. Facebook and Twitter and all of these. Sam said, right, my son down in Grenada. He said, they don't need these substitutes for human interaction. They just interact. I mean, everybody, no matter who it is, you don't even know them on the street. They'll stop and talk to you for ages. If they've got time, they'll go and have a pineapple juice or a beer. They want to get to know you. They want to be your friend.
Wow.
What a lovely environment. And then they got all the grandmas, who, if you get out of line, you better not get out of line, you young hoods down there at the St. George's, because grandma is always waiting.